Okay, 15 January. Welcome to This and That, Information. And what we're going to look at is another part of the beginning to Michael Heinrich's book of 2021 on how to read capital. And this is just to fill in a couple of things that are important as we move further, and I hope you'll find this useful. This is the section on commentary on the beginning of Capital. The work's main title, Capital, makes clear that Marx is not concerned with the economy in a general trans-historical sense, but rather with a historically specific mode of production, that is, the capitalist mode of production. People often pay attention to the work's main title, but not the subtitle, that is, a critique of political economy to begin with. The term political economy requires some explanation. It's not Marx's invention, is by no means intended to emphasize the political character of economic issues as it is sometimes supposed. In ancient and medieval scholarship, the word economy stood for housekeeping. That is, the Greek word oikos means house. The economy of the entire polity only became an independent topic of investigation in the early modern period. To distinguish the latter from household economy, people began to speak in the 17th century of political economy. In England and France during the 19th century, this was the usual term applied to what is today roughly called economics. It was only toward the end of the 19th century that the term economics became the usual one in the English language. Through the early 19th century, Germans still spoke of national economy or Nationalökonomie. A book's subtitle often tries to explain or clarify the meaning of the title. In choosing the subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy, Marx implies two things. First, that he is not just aiming to depict capitalist relations, but also critiquing them. Second, that he's not critiquing just individual theories or conclusions, but rather the whole of political economy, the entire science, and expressing these relations. Addendum. The twin tasks of depicting capitalist relations and critiquing economic science are not separable. For Marx, they mutually condition each other. In a letter to Lassalle, Marx describes his project as follows. The work I'm presently concerned with is a critique of political categories, or, if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy. It is at once an expose, and by the same token, a critique of the system. Marx's letter to Kugelmann from December 28, 1862, also makes clear his aim of criticizing an entire science. There, Marx places capital among the scientific attempts to revolutionize a science. Marx also stresses the scientific character of his critique in this letter. In effect, he does not contrast critique and science. The works of Scottish economist Adam Smith and English economist David Ricardo dominated political economy until the second half of the 19th century. Marx considered them the most important representatives of classical political economy and refers to them frequently in Capital. However, the 1870s brought the marginalist revolution in economics. Instead of basing a commodity's value on the labor expended in its production, as Smith and Ricardo did, marginalism focuses on utility, or more exactly, marginal utility, which is the increase in utility that an additional good yields. By the end of the 19th century, the classical political economy of Smith and Ricardo was considered obsolete. The neoclassical school dominant today in universities and economic research institutes is the direct heir of the marginal utility school. Since Marx also saw a connection between value and expended labor, neoclassical economists consider him to be part of classical political economy and therefore obsolete. They do not pay attention to Marx's aim of critiquing the entirety of economic science. Also, they completely ignore the question of whether Marx's critique remains limited to classical political economy or if it is indeed so fundamental that it also applies to modern economic theories. We cannot decide in advance how and whether Marx redeems his claim to criticize an entire science. That claim must be demonstrated by a reading of Capital. I, that is Michael Heinrich, will comment on the title of Book 1, The Process of Production of Capital, when discussing the table of contents. Preface to the first edition. In prefaces, one does not usually find scholarly arguments, but rather an author's declaration of an intent about what he wishes to present and how he intends to proceed. On their own, such statements do not prove anything at all. They merely offer an initial orientation that the reader can verify in the text that follows, which is why I will return to the preface at appropriate moments. Here, I limit myself to addressing only the most salient points. The systematic commentary begins with the text of Chapter 1. A. The difficulty of the beginning, bourgeois society. Abstraction. Marx begins by pointing out that Capital is the continuation of a contribution to the critique of political economy published in 1859. He adds that the content of that work is summarized in Chapter 1 of Capital. Marx is referring to Commodity and Money, Chapter 1 of the first edition of Capital. From the second edition forward, it was made into the first section bearing the same name, but is now subdivided into 3 chapters. Marx calls attention to the specific difficulties of the beginning, which is dedicated to presenting the commodity. He observes that a complete body is easier to study than an individual cell, while claiming that for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or the value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. Addendum. Here, Marx does not specify what he means by the term bourgeois society, sometimes translated also as civil society. However, he goes into somewhat more detail in the preface to the contribution of the critique of political economy. Marx speaks there of the material conditions of life, the totality of which Hegel, following the example of English and French thinkers of the 18th century, refers to with the term civil society. These English and French thinkers of the 18th century examined the social relations of emerging capitalism, where individuals pursued their particular economic interests in the market. In his philosophy of right, Hegel sums up these new relationships as bourgeois society or civil society, which he locates between the intimate realm of the family and the public political realm of the state. When Marx speaks of bourgeois society, he has these modern capitalist relations in mind. The same holds when he speaks later on in Capital of the bourgeois mode of production. Only after addressing Marx's analysis of the commodity will we be able to discuss what he means by claiming that the commodity form is bourgeois society's quote-unquote economic cell form. Marx calls attention to a further point. In the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both. This remark shows that Marx intends to do more than simply describe the immediately visible phenomena of capitalism. However, to understand the central role of abstraction in Capital, we will need to get deeper into Marx's arguments. At the beginning of Chapter 1, we will return to the question of abstraction. The object of investigation, B. What I have to examine in this work is the capitalist mode of production and the relations of production and forms of intercourse that correspond to it. Until now, their locus classicus has been England. This is the reason why England is used as the main illustration of the theoretical developments I make. It's not surprising, in light of Capital's title, that Marx defines the object of his investigation as the capitalist mode of production. What is remarkable are the distinctions that he makes. Marx contrasts his theoretical developments and their illustration in the English context. His focus is not the analysis of English capitalism, but rather these theoretical developments. In the next paragraph, he says this about his theoretical focus. Intrinsically, it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms that spring from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of the tendencies winning their way through and working themselves out with iron necessity. Marx is thus concerned neither with one historical phase of capitalist development nor with the historical sequence of capitalist development's individual stages, but rather with the laws, quote unquote, of the capitalist mode of production. There are many historical passages in Capital. However, based on what Marx says here, we can assume that the historical presentation is subordinated to the theoretical development. For further discussion of the subordination, see the last point in Appendix 6, the infamous Appendix 6 that was mentioned yesterday. The aforementioned laws apply not only to a specific phase of capitalism, but wherever capitalism is the predominant mode of production. For that reason, Marx says somewhat later on, it is the ultimate aim of this work, Capital, to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society. My emphasis makes clear the general character of Marx's account, how it refers not to a specific society, but rather to modern capitalist society as such, in contrast to feudal or ancient society, the two prior modes of production. Only by reading Capital can we decide whether Marx actually succeeds in providing such a universal account, or whether he sometimes confounds specific and transitory traits of the capitalist mode of production with universal laws of capitalism. What is clear, however, is Marx's intention. Addendum. There are two formerly common ways of reading Capital that conceived of the work's object in a way that contradicts Marx's intention, even if the advocates of these interpretations failed to see the contradiction. The first reading originates with Karl Kautsky, who is considered the leading theoretical mind of social democracy after the death of Friedrich Engels. Kautsky held that Marx primarily aimed to describe the historical development of capitalism. The second reading is mostly popular in the context of Marxism-Leninism. It contends that Marx analyzed the competitive capitalism of the 19th century. Later on, Lenin continued Marx's analysis by examining the monopoly capitalism of the 20th century. In the first conception, Marx is made a historian of capitalism. In the second, he becomes a theorist of a specific capitalist phase. Both ways of reading contradict the claims Marx articulated in the preface. So automatically, Heinrich is staking out the differences, that there is a Kautsky interpretation and that there is a Lenin interpretation, both of which can be seen as somewhat problematic. Section C, people as personifications of economic categories. Marx emphasizes that although he does not depict the capitalist and landowner with rosy colors, he is not criticizing the behavior of individuals, because individuals are dealt with here only insofar as they are the personification of economic categories, the bearers of particular class relations and interests. My standpoint, from which the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains, socially speaking, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. Here, Marx is not concerned with capitalists as individual people, but only with capitalists to the extent that they personify something. That is, to the degree that social relations determine the logic of their actions. What this logic is, and the extent to which individuals are compelled to follow it, will not be discussed here. It will be dealt with later in Marx's account. However, there is another important point. In the passage quoted, Marx refers to categories, class relations, and then just relations. Yet we must distinguish between the category, that is, the scientific expression of a social relation, and the social relation itself. Whereas the latter, that is the social relation, are relations between people in a society. The former categories are scientific constructs used to grasp these relations. A society consists of multiple social relations that exist simultaneously and mutually influence each other. Nevertheless, in a scientific account, the individual categories expressing the social relations must be developed one after the other. When approaching a category for the first time, we therefore cannot consider all the relationships in which the particular social relation expressed by the category stands. Later in this commentary, we will return to the relationship between categories and social relations. In the passage quoted above, Marx's language is not very precise. People are not personifications of a category, but of a social relation to the extent that they follow this relation's logic of action. If we examine this social relation scientifically, deciphering the operating logic concealed within it, then we create a concept or category for the relation. Marx uses concept and category more or less synonymously. So it would be more precise to say that a capitalist personifies the social relation expressed by the category of capital. In effect, by distinguishing between category and social relation, we can understand Marx's claim that individuals are personifications of economic categories as an abbreviated manner of speaking. While reading Capital, we should always pay close attention to whether the text is dealing with economic categories, that is to say, the analysis of social relations and the logics of action they include, but still without taking active individuals into consideration, or whether it is examining the actions of individuals as personifications of these categories. Section D, natural laws of capitalist production. In the second quote in section B above, Marx speaks of the natural laws of capitalist production. Likewise, the quote presented above refers to the economic formation of society as a process of natural history. Such language raises the issue of how justified we are in speaking of laws that operate in society and economy, and whether Marx's conceptions amount to a historical determinism. In fact, we can only seriously discuss such issues based on Marx's analysis, not the preface. Generally, we should recognize that the social and intellectual context in which Marx made these statements was completely different from today's. When Marx wrote these lines in 1867, he was opposing the predominant form of historiography, which saw history as mainly an affair of great men or great ideas, while relegating material and economic conditions to a completely subordinate role. In contrast to this subjective and idealist focus, Marx emphasized the objective, structural aspects of history. He therefore spoke provocatively of the development of an economic social formation as a process of natural history and of the natural laws of the capitalist mode of production. Historical approaches centered on individual subjects have by no means disappeared today. However, since Marx's time, even non-Marxist historical writing has, albeit to varying degrees, gotten used to reflecting on the objective and material aspects of development. Conversely, traditional worldview Marxism frequently overemphasized the objective features of history to the point of historical determinism, not the least by relying on the short account of Marx's conception of history found in the preface to the contribution of the Critique of Political Economy, which I will briefly, this is Heinrich, address in the commentary on Marx's treatment of the commodity fetish. For that reason, one becomes suspicious today when people refer to the natural laws of social development without qualification. Today, the discursive context is quite different from that of Marx's time, and we must therefore assume that he used this terminology in a far more open, less biased sense than people do today. Section E, scientific inquiry and social struggles. At the end of the preface, Marx observes that in the field of political economy, free scientific inquiry faces not only its usual enemies, but also, because of its content, the furies of private interest. Marx obviously sees his own projects as scientific inquiry, which is not the same as working on behalf of particular interests. See current politics. Addendum. Marx is very committed to his reasoning having a scientific character, as we saw above in his comments to Kugelman on the work's title. Marx despised the idea of twisting scientific arguments to promote particular interests. In Theories of Surplus Value, he wrote about the economist Malthus, whom he accused of doing exactly that. But when a man seeks to accommodate science to a viewpoint which is derived not from science itself, however erroneous it may be, but from outside, from alien, external interests, then I call him base. Contrary to what is frequently said, Marx does not, in his own view, adopt a specific standpoint, that is, of the proletariat or a future socialist society. We'll see more about that at 6 o'clock, in order to analyze the capitalist mode of production from that perspective. However, the scientific objectivity that Marx lays claim to doesn't make science unpolitical. For example, his discoveries about the nature of capitalism and the consequences of the capitalist mode of production for the majority of people can indeed be used as a weapon in political struggle. In a letter from April 17th, 1867, Marx thus refers to capital as, quote, the most terrible missile that has yet been hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie, landowners included, unquote. For Marx, change does not begin only after the elimination of capitalism. Instead, he emphasizes that capitalism itself changes. The present society is no solid crystal, but an organism capable of change and constantly engaged in a process of change. The results that are missiles in the struggle are not dogmas, but rather the outcomes of scientific inquiry. For that reason, the analyses they rest upon cannot simply be accepted, but must be discussed and verified. Hence, Marx writes at the end of the preface, I welcome every opinion based on scientific criticism. As we can see, Marx expects anything but credulous readers. At the same time, he emphasizes that he's never yielded to the prejudices of so-called public opinion. Marx ends the preface presenting a modified quote from Dante's Divine Comedy as his motto. Go on your way and let the people talk. Addendum. Here, Marx picks up where he left off at the end of the preface to the contribution of the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. There, he sketches his trajectory of study, adding that the sketch is intended to demonstrate how my views, no matter how they may be judged and how little they conform to the interested prejudices of the ruling classes, are the outcome of conscientious research carried on over many years. At the entrance to science, as at the entrance to hell, the demand must be made. Here all misgiving must thy mind reject. Here cowardice must die and be no more. The final quote also comes from Dante's Divine Comedy, in which the Roman poet Virgil guides the author Dante through the various circles of hell. The claim that scientific inquiry must cast off misgivings and cowardice refers to how the outcomes of analysis should be treated. We must stand by the outcomes of serious inquiry, regardless of how they offend the prejudices of public opinion or the ruling classes. The left also has prejudices and is often unwilling to let scientific analysis destroy its cherished opinions about a situation. Against this, Marx stresses later on in Capital that he's not interested in a critique which knows how to judge and condemn the present, but not how to comprehend it. Real criticism becomes impossible unless it is willing to comprehend without being afraid of the results. The 3 volumes of Capital, section F. The first volume of Capital's complete title is The Process of Production of Capital. It is striking that Marx refers to both volumes and books at the end of the preface. In effect, Capital was to comprise 4 books, which Marx wanted to publish in 3 volumes. After Marx's death, Engels published Book 2 as the 2nd volume in 1885 and Book 3 as the 3rd volume in 1894. The result is that today, no one any longer distinguishes between book and volume. Marx's manuscript, Theories of Surplus Value, was later published in the Marx-Engels Werk under the title The 4th Volume of Capital. However, this text is not identical with the planned Book 4, nor is it even a direct preliminary work. Despite its many digressions, the manuscript of the Theories of Surplus Value focuses exclusively on the history of a single category, surplus value. This manuscript is part of the research process that led to Capital. The Book 4, planned by Marx, does not exist. The titles of the 3 extant books clearly indicate that they deal with interrelated material. We can therefore consider them to be a complete work. Preface to the 2nd edition. The postface to the second edition that follows the preface in the Penguin Classics edition in MECW 35 should be treated as what it is, a postface. Marx placed it at the end of the text, and it obviously presupposes familiarity with capital. The postface contains remarks about the evolution of political economy and about Marx's manner of presentation. However, we cannot discuss these issues before entering into Marx's account. Therefore, I will only refer to the postface later on in the commentary when doing so can shed light on certain passages, the table of contents. As with any scientific work, it's a good idea to get a rough overview of its structure from the table of contents before beginning to read. We will not understand everything, but certainly will learn that some topics expected early appear only later on and vice versa. The first book of Capital bears the title, The Process of Production of Capital, which is a double meaning in the original German. Der Produktionsprozess des Kapitals. The phrase could be either a genitivus subjectivus or a genitivus subjectivus. On the one hand, it could refer to a production process dominated by capital, that is, capital as the subject of the production process, genitivus subjectivus. On the other hand, it could refer to the process by which capital is produced, that is, capital as the object of the production process, genitivus subjectivus. We will soon discover that both meanings are at play in the table of contents. Yes, it sounds the same. In the English translation, the book is divided into 8 parts, which all contain individual chapters. The German original has a somewhat different division into parts and chapters. Part 1 is called Commodities and Money, whereas Part 2 is called The Transformation of Money into Capital. Evidently, Marx does not immediately begin by examining capital. Next come 3 parts dealing with the production of surplus value, where we find an analysis of the production process dominated by capital. Only after that comes Part 6, Wages. This sequence should be kept in mind when reading Part 2. There, Marx addresses, among other things, the sale and purchase of labor power, but the examination of wages is still to come. Part 7 is called The Process of Accumulation of Capital. The second chapter in this part, that is the 24th chapter of the book as a whole, is titled The Transformation of Surplus Value into Capital. Hence, this part is both about how capital is produced and about how new capital is produced. Part 8 is called the so-called primitive accumulation. As the parts chapter titles indicate, it deals with the historical emergence of the capitalist mode of production. As we can see, the structure of capital emphasizes the difference between theoretical development and historical process mentioned in the preface. See point B above. Tellingly, Marx does not begin with the historical emergence of capitalist production, but rather places it at the end of his analysis. That is, the historical sketch follows the theoretical development and presupposes it. Now, since our reading begins with Part 1, let's take a closer look at its structure. Part 1 is divided into 3 chapters. Chapter 1, the commodity. Chapter 2, the process of exchange. Chapter 3, money, or the circulation of commodities. Now, this breakdown may seem surprising. Doesn't the commodity always have something to do with exchange? And doesn't exchange always have to do with money, at least in the capitalist mode of production, which is what we're supposed to be examining? Judging the usefulness of Marx's organization of the material will require reading further. However, during the course of reading, we should not only raise questions about each chapter's content, but also about its unity, that is, the thread that runs through its material and how it differs from the next chapter. It makes sense to also ask such questions at the end of each of the volume's 8 parts. In doing so, consider the role of each chapter in the overall structure of the argument. Is it a matter of making the previous chapter more specific, completing it, or embarking on a new level of argumentation. So I put in the text as it appears in Heinrich's text, A Guide to Reading the Reading of Capital of 2021. And you can see with the italics and the addenda, Heinrich has means some very specific things about the structure of the text. So I included it with all of its little specificities, so you can read it in that context. The text itself is available. It can be downloaded, so you can also consult that as well. Now, I picked a shorter thing to read today because I wanted to talk about this overall in the fact that there are certain modern ideas that are going on here. Capitalism is often, to some folks, seen as the gateway to a whole theory of the modern. That is, that the modern era is one defined or described by capital, and in many ways it is. Not everyone has that interpretation, but it is that question of discovering certain modern things, right? The sense of the individual, the increased subjectivity of individuals, the giving of rights to individuals as opposed to polities or rulers or whatever. So all of those things are at work. I mean, they exist not only at the level of the state, but also at the level of culture. And so all of those modern things, modern things, exist at the same time. That you have that sense of awareness, the sort of existential realization of the finitude of life, et cetera, the decline in religion, which only makes certain people more committed to their ideological position on religion more important. And it is, as Professor John will be talking about in tonight's spirituality section, I hope, about, well, at least there's the the video on the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age in some ways signals that transformation. That is the transformation of the mode of production to things that allow for greater leisure time, allow for greater wealth or prosperity. And of course, we know that that's not equally distributed, and that's what becomes problematic in the 19th century. But yet, we have a certain faith in the modern, whether it is technology or some version of the spirit. And you can interpret that however way you want. Some people have more or less faith in technology. And its ability to separate people from their everyday labors, whatever that means, and their everyday life. And so that's a kind of important idea. So I wanted to sort of close with that because I'm going to show at 6 o'clock The Shape of Things to Come. It's an H.G. Wells movie, not directed by him, of course, but the contrast, of course, is between this film as an English film of 1936 with Metropolis, the prior Metropolis, a silent film that deals with a much more, perhaps, cruder division of labor. And so utopian films of one kind or another are always important. They are what makes science fiction interesting. And I would assert that it's interesting that Shape of Things to Come, as well as some other films of the era, try to predict the modern, just as the Shape of Things to Come, for example, streamlining of the Art Deco / Art Nouveau period is another example of that separation of cultural modifications of nature, the advancements, the transformations, the culturalizing of nature, blah, 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 blah. All of those things are there. And so the Gilded Age appears at the, for some people, the height or the acme or whatever of the Industrial Revolution. For some people, it is the second rather than the first Industrial Revolution. And yes, there's all kinds of stories about that we can tell. So all of those things exist. So that's sort of the conclusion of my little comments on today's reading. Tomorrow, yeah, we're going to do more of this stuff. I've already put that up, so you can stare at that. Let's see if there's any questions, comments, brickbats. Oh, a ceasefire has been officially reached in the Israel-Palestine conflict. We'll see whether it is broken. And of course, if you know the history of ceasefires, in some ways they're meant to be broken. And so we'll see on Sunday whether that occurs. Of course, the coincidence between that and the rise of Trump and Trumpism is obviously intentional in some ways. They want to make a Reagan-like comparison, which is
Absolutely.
sad and pathetic and its most important in terms of propaganda, whatever, disinformation. So we'll see that. If there are no brickbats or whatever, I will end the share, if assuming I have control over this particular process. Yes, I will now end the live stream so we can go back to swearing. And let me remind you that at 6 o'clock, I have intended to show whether or not my bandwidth holds out, but it's there. And I've included a link to a page in Daily Kos where you can read the John does slides. I do single pages where you can scroll down, which is what I'll do at 6 o'clock. So let me stop the live.